Hey, this is Brandon again, coming to you talking about the connecting of the 21st century church to God's heart for Jerusalem. And I want to continue where I left off in session 8, speaking from Matthew 24, and want to emphasize particularly the verse in verse 14 all the way down to verse 29, as referencing the gospel of the kingdom that Jesus is referring to when he's giving the signs of the end and the particular specific events concerning his return. And he begins the verse, the chapter, with verse 1 talking about the temple in Jerusalem. And so the backdrop, the contextual backdrop of Matthew 24 is the temple in Jerusalem. And when I was there in Jerusalem and I was standing on the Mount of Olives and I was looking over at the Dome of the Rock and the place where the temple was, it hit me that God, Jesus, was actually giving an end-time treatise on what was going to be happening in Jerusalem right before his return. And I think a lot of times the church, especially in the Western world, especially our expression in United States and our doctrinal denominational expression, specifically our Roman expression, begins or attempts to make that Matthew 24 end time events, speaking of the whole world, or speaking of the West, or speaking of our nation, when it talks about nation against nation and kingdom against kingdom, wars and rumors of wars all over the world. But it's speaking consistently in these verses about Jerusalem. And so when we talk about this gospel of the kingdom, there's a message that he's actually saying is going to be preached in all the world as a witness before the end comes. And then he gives that message, what that message is. He tells what that message is after Matthew 24:14. So in Matthew 24:15, he begins what this message that is going to be preached in all the world as a witness before the end comes is. He says that the abomination of desolation is going to be seen, and it's going to be spoken. That was spoken of by Daniel. So this is a message, this is the gospel, this is the good news. Good news? Yes, there's good news in all of the end time events. The good news is consummated in verse 29, the gospel of the kingdom, the gospel of Jesus coming and setting his kingdom in the earth is consummated in verse 29, which I told you is the words of comfort that God is going to raise up through voices crying out in the wilderness, comforting his people and speaking tenderly to Jerusalem. Hold on, help's on the way. Hold on, look up, for your redemption is drawing nigh. That verse 29 talks about immediately after the tribulation in those days, the sun would be darkened and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heaven shall be shaken, and then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the earth mourn, and then they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with great power and great glory. Then it says, he shall send his angels with the great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. What is that saying? That's the particular and specific message of comfort that we know in the Western world from 1 Thessalonians as a rapture. This rapture is speaking of his elect out of the city of Jerusalem, out of the midst of the war, out of the midst of the judgment of war, out of the midst of the nations of the earth coming against them, out of the midst of the tribulation, he comes and catches his saints away. And then he begins to war on their behalf against the nations of the world. This is the gospel of the kingdom that's going to be preached as a witness to all the world before the end comes. In the midst of that time, in the midst of that time of sorrow, in the midst of that time of tribulation, as God's heart is being reconnected to his people and to that city, and as his people's heart is being turned back to him, there's going to be a message that's going to be preached about the coming of the Lord and the end of the age events and how to maneuver through the time of tribulation, how to find your way through the time of the shaking of the nations. And I'm going to stop right there, but I just wanted to re-emphasize session 8 and let you know that there's a message that God is putting in the mouths of voices of comfort. And that message pertains to the end of the age and the revelation of Jesus Christ and his coming to the earth to set up his kingdom in the city of Jerusalem. And in the last 4 or 5 months since I got back from Jerusalem, my heart has been gripped with the connecting of God's church with his heart for Jerusalem. And we've been having interest meetings every Saturday in Gahanna at 81 Mill Street, Gahanna, Ohio, Suite 210, second floor of the Gahanna Conference Center, where we are meeting to develop a leadership team to launch a church, Yeshua Life Ctr, a place where we can raise up watchmen on the wall that will give him no rest until he makes Jerusalem a praise in the earth. If you have time on Saturdays from 6 to 8, come and hear and see what God is doing and what God is saying in preparation for the greatest revival that's ever going to hit. All other revivals are going to consummate in this revival that's coming as God is establishing his church as a house of prayer in the earth. God bless you. Hope to see you there.